Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Cinderella Man, starring Russell Crowe, Renee Zellweger, Paul Giamatti, Craig Bierko, Patty Considine, and Bruce McGill, and directed by Ron Howard. Now, I remember going to theaters for this thing, and I was in high school when this thing came out. Did I like it then? I remember it being kind of boring, but let's see if it still remains the case when I get into the review. Let's get into it. In the year 1928, Jim Braddock, played by Russell Crowe, wins a fight, and his manager Joel Gould, played by Paul Giamatti, pays him and says to him, "You'll get your shot," and takes him home with his wife to his wife May, played by Renee Zellweger, and kids Joy, Rosemary, and Howard along with her sister. But these characters are inspirational to watch, particularly Jim, as he's an inspiring boxer, as they're poor in the Great Depression and begs for a job that's not boxing, which will give him the big bucks. And I like the setup as well as the set decoration of Manhattan during the Great Depression. Jay steals meat from the butcher's place as Jim makes him return it to the butchers, and I like the story as it's not as heavy as last time with The Beautiful Mind, where the material was heavy for a PG 13 rating, but here, this is also PG 13, but it's sort of heavy, but not as heavy as last time. Jim boxes against Feldman with Joe on his side. As it gets brutal, Jim uses his left hand as it's a draw, and the fight was an embarrassment as he's being called pathetic, and Jim gets his boxing license revoked by Jimmy Johnson, played by Bruce McGill, because of a broken hand. And Maeve thinks about putting the kids at her sister's place as Jim made a promise to Jay earlier in the film that he, Rosemary, and Howard won't get sent away, which is rather depressing. Jim gets work at some point and meets Mike Wilson, played by Patty Considine, who at break time buys him a beer despite it's been a while since he's drank beer, which is rather kind of funny. Jim and May's rent is due and get locked out of their apartment, and they get some wood from a random place for firewood, and Howard is sick. And I like how realistic the movie is as far as the Great Depression is concerned, as the boys stayed at May's father's place in Brooklyn, while Rosemary stays at the sister's place. Jim takes a trip to Madison Square Garden in New York City and to ask for money, and Joe feels bad about it that he later gets him a boxing jobs later in the film, and Jim gets the kids back home and celebrate a birthday at a church as Jim stops a fight between another man and wife and just pushes the man into a car. And Joe tells Jim he has a fight in Madison Square Garden against John Griffin, and gets a welcome back from cheer from the crowd, and the performances are mesmerizing. I will say that much. During the fight between Jim and Griffin, Griffin falls down as Jim wins, and the fight as a miracle, and watches the fight between Primo Canera and Max Baer, played by Craig Bierko, who's a killer in the ring. Jim comes home to the family and tells them that he won the fight, and they're all so happy for him. The next day, he works at that point again and gets noticed at the plant, and Jim gets a second chance from the world of boxing as May comes to Joe's place to talk with him about Jim's boxing career and gets him a fight with John Lewis again as he's prepared for the fight like Rocky Balboa does, which is an amazing training sequence. The fight between Jim and Lewis goes well as gets Lewis down, and he gets up, and we move on to the next fight where it doesn't go too great as he gets punched in the rib and almost gets knocked out. But several rounds later, Jim wins the fight and is number one in the world of boxing. And his next fight is with Max Baer, which is going to be an intense fight because of the reason why I brought up that he's a killer in the ring. Mike Wilson is killed in a riot, which is rather sad to me. Jim gets interviewed with the press, and one reporter says to May that Max has killed two people in the ring, And I love the way Renee Zellweger reacts in that scene as she's scared for her husband's life. As Jim watches footage of Max killing two people in the ring, as he's not too scared about it, and that is good acting by both Russell Crowe and Renee Zellweger, and hell, even Paul Giamatti, who the year before this he had Sideways, and now he's doing another good performance. Jim and May have dinner with Joe and his wife as Joe reads an article from a newspaper about how he's an inspiration and is called the Cinderella Man as Max arrives at the same restaurant as he tells Jim he doesn't want to hurt him and tries to talk to Joe and May about how Jim shouldn't take the fight as May thinks about herself as a widow after the fight is over and she loses her mind as she's afraid for Jim's life, like I said earlier. And the acting in this scene is well done by both of these actors. On the day of the fight, June 13th, 1935, as this movie sometimes moves year after year, as it didn't bother me that much, I actually didn't mind. Jim goes to the fight and May goes to the church to pray for him, as well as other people, and the kids go to May's sister's place with no radio as we arrive at the Madison Square Garden Bowl as Joe prepares for the fight, which will be very intense as May arrives before the fight to say to Jim, "I'll see you at home." And Jim goes to the ring as the audience is very quiet as they pray for him and cheer for him, which is a cheer worthy moment. The fight begins with Max beating up on Jim, and Jim makes a comeback by punching him while holding his arm captive. And the shots during these scenes are tremendous. And Max hits Jim multiple times in the ribs as it gets crazy during that scene. Max torments Jim about his wife, and Joe distracts Max as Jim fights for his life. And the next round comes, and Max gives Jim a menacing punch, and Jim is fighting back like crazy. This is so far great, getting very intense. Goes to the sister's place and sees the kids hearing the fight, as she's worried to death to hear as Joe tells Jim to bury Max, as Max grabs his head like he's a giant, like he's been doing quite a few times in the scenes. And the crowd chants, "Braddock, Braddock," as Max does send a punch to Jim as Joe loses his control. And the last round comes as Jim and Max go at it as Jim beats up on Max as Joe says, "Stay away from him." And Jim gets punched into the ropes, and as Max almost gets knocked down but Jim fights back and the crowd goes wild by gathering up to the ring and they beat up on each other. And Jim gets the last punch as they're both standing as Jim wins the fight. And everyone goes wild as the audience watching this movie is. And this fight was more intense than I remembered for damn sure. But it was a damn good ending. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 8.1 out of 10. The boxing scenes are shot very well, and the performances in this movie were absolutely believable. And I like how accurate it was, as well as in the Great Depression. And the movie does a good job telling another underdog story like Rocky. And I usually like boxing movies, but this one was well made for me. So I would like to thank you guys for joining me, and until I get to the next series, put your hands up.